There's something society has been hiding from women for centuries, and Carl Jung saw it clearly. He understood that beneath the surface of what we call proper feminine behavior lies a shadow so powerful, so raw, that entire cultures have built walls to contain it. Today, we're diving deep into the forbidden territory of female desire, the parts of feminine sexuality that have been buried, shamed, and twisted into something unrecognizable. Jung didn't just study the mind. He excavated the hidden chambers of human sexuality that most psychologists were too afraid to explore. And what he found about women's sexual nature would shock even the most progressive minds today. Because the truth is, everything you've been told about female desire is a carefully constructed lie designed to keep women disconnected from their most primal power. Think about this for a moment. When a man expresses sexual desire, he's seen as natural, biological, even expected. But when a woman does the same, suddenly there are labels, judgments, entire moral frameworks designed to shame her back into silence. Jung called this the collective shadow projection, where society takes its own fears about female sexuality and forces women to carry that shame as if it were their own. The reality Jung uncovered is that women's sexual desires are often more complex, more intense, and more multifaceted than men's. But here's where it gets interesting and disturbing. From childhood, girls are taught to disconnect from their bodies, to view their sexuality through the lens of what others want from them rather than what they want for themselves. They're taught that their value lies in being desired, not in desiring. Jung observed that this creates what he called the anima possession in reverse. Instead of men projecting their feminine side onto women, women begin projecting their authentic sexual selves onto an idealized version of femininity that doesn't actually exist. They become strangers to their own desires, performing a version of sexuality that was written by others, for others. Let me tell you about one of Jung's most controversial observations. He noticed that many of his female patients suffered from what he termed erotic amnesia. These were women who had completely lost touch with their sexual instincts, not because they were naturally less sexual, but because they had been so thoroughly conditioned to suppress these feelings that they literally forgot how to access them. One woman came to Jung describing herself as frigid and broken. Through their work together, Jung discovered that she had been sexually vibrant as a young girl, curious, exploratory, alive with desire. But years of being told that good girls don't think about such things had created a psychological wall between her conscious mind and her sexual self. The desire was still there, Jung realized, but it had been banished to the shadow realm of her unconscious. This is where Jung's understanding becomes revolutionary. He didn't see repressed female sexuality as a personal failing or even a social problem to be fixed with better education. He saw it as a form of collective psychosis, a mass disconnection from one of the most fundamental aspects of human nature. Jung wrote in his private journals, which weren't published until decades after his death, "The modern woman has been taught to fear the very force that could liberate her. Her sexual energy, when fully expressed, threatens not just individual relationships, but entire power structures that depend on her remaining unconscious of her true nature." But here's what makes this even more complex. Jung discovered that when women do begin to reconnect with their authentic sexual desires, they often experience what he called shadow eruption. Years of repressed sexuality don't just gently reintegrate into consciousness. They explode back into awareness with an intensity that can feel overwhelming, even dangerous. Many women describe this awakening as terrifying because they realize how much of their lives they've been living as sexual ghosts, going through the motions of intimacy without ever truly inhabiting their bodies. They discover desires they never knew they had, fantasies that shock them, needs that seem to contradict everything they thought they knew about themselves. Jung noticed something fascinating about this process. Women who underwent this sexual awakening often reported that it wasn't just about sex at all. Reconnecting with their erotic energy seemed to unlock creativity, assertiveness, intuition, and a kind of personal power they had never experienced before, as if sexuality wasn't separate from the rest of their being, but was actually the fuel that powered their entire life force. This is where Jung's concept of the sacred prostitute becomes relevant, though not in the way most people understand it. Jung wasn't talking about actual prostitution. He was referring to an archetype, a psychological pattern where a woman owns her sexuality completely, uses it consciously, and refuses to let others define her erotic nature for her. The sacred prostitute archetype represents a woman who has integrated her shadow, who has reclaimed the parts of herself that society labeled as shameful or dangerous. She's not performing sexuality for male approval or social acceptance. She's expressing it as a natural extension of her authentic self. But here's the trap that Jung identified. Even when women begin to reclaim their sexuality, they often fall into what he called reactive sexuality. Instead of discovering what they truly desire, they rebel against sexual repression by doing the opposite of what they were taught, which is still allowing external forces to dictate their sexual expression. Jung saw this in many of his patients. Women who had been raised to be sexually conservative would swing to hypersexuality, not because that's what their authentic selves wanted, but because it felt like rebellion. But rebellion against conditioning isn't the same as authentic expression. It's still a reaction to programming rather than a genuine choice. The path Jung outlined for integrating sexual shadow work is neither suppression nor rebellion, but what he called conscious sexuality. This means becoming aware of all the messages, expectations, and fears that have shaped your sexual identity, and then slowly, carefully, beginning to separate your true desires from the layers of conditioning. One of Jung's most radical insights was that women's sexual energy operates differently from men's. He observed that female sexuality tends to be more cyclical, more connected to emotional and spiritual states, more influenced by relationship dynamics and environmental factors. But instead of honoring these differences, society has tried to force female sexuality into male patterns, creating even more disconnection and confusion. Jung wrote about a patient who told him, "I feel like I'm performing sex rather than having it." This woman had learned to mimic what she thought sexual passion should look like based on movies, books, and social expectations, but she had never actually experienced her own authentic arousal. She was so focused on being sexually appealing that she had forgotten how to be sexually alive. Through shadow work, Jung helped her recognize that her real turn-ons were completely different from what she had been performing. She discovered that her sexuality was deeply connected to feeling emotionally safe, to being in natural environments, to slow, deliberate intimacy rather than passionate intensity. None of this matched the cultural script she had been following, but it matched her authentic nature. What does this shadow integration actually look like in practical terms? Jung developed specific techniques for helping women reconnect with their repressed sexuality. He would have them explore their sexual fantasies without judgment, not to act them out necessarily, but to understand what these fantasies revealed about their unconscious desires. He noticed that many women's sexual fantasies involved scenarios where they were completely free from social judgment, where they could express desire without consequence. This wasn't just about physical acts, but about psychological freedom, the ability to want what they wanted without shame or apology. Jung also had women examine their relationships with their own bodies. He found that sexual repression almost always involved some form of body disconnection. Women who had been taught that their sexuality was dangerous or shameful often developed a split between their minds and their physical sensations. They could think about sex intellectually, but they couldn't feel it viscerally. One technique Jung used was having women simply notice their physical responses throughout the day without trying to change anything. Not just sexual arousal, but all forms of physical pleasure and aliveness. The taste of food, the feeling of sunlight on skin, the satisfaction of stretching or moving. He understood that sexual energy isn't separate from general life energy, and that reconnecting with physical pleasure in all its forms was essential for sexual healing. But Jung also warned about the dangers of this process. He observed that when women begin to reclaim their sexual shadow, they often trigger intense reactions in their partners, families, and communities. A woman who suddenly starts expressing authentic desire, who stops performing sexuality and starts embodying it, can be perceived as threatening to people who benefited from her sexual unconsciousness. Jung documented cases where husbands became threatened when their wives underwent sexual awakening through therapy. These men had been comfortable with wives who were sexually available, but not sexually autonomous. When these women began to express their own desires, set boundaries, and seek their own satisfaction, it challenged the entire dynamic of their relationships. This is what Jung meant when he said that individual psychological healing always has social and political implications. A woman who integrates her sexual shadow doesn't just change her personal life, she becomes a challenge to every system that depends on female sexual unconsciousness. Jung believed that the mass repression of female sexuality wasn't an accident or even just a byproduct of religious morality. He saw it as a deliberate, unconscious strategy for maintaining certain power structures. Women who are disconnected from their own desire are easier to control, easier to manipulate, more likely to seek validation from external sources rather than trusting their inner knowing. But when a woman reconnects with her sexual shadow, something profound shifts. She becomes less concerned with being desired and more focused on desiring. She becomes less willing to compromise her authentic nature for social acceptance. She develops what Jung called erotic intelligence, the ability to use her sexual energy as a source of creativity, intuition, and personal power. This erotic intelligence isn't just about bedroom activities. Jung observed that women who had integrated their sexual shadows often became more successful in their careers, more creative in their artistic expression, more confident in their decision-making. It was as if accessing their repressed sexuality had unlocked access to their full life force. Now here's where Jung's observations become especially relevant for modern women. He predicted that as society became more sexually liberated on the surface, the shadow repression would actually become more subtle and therefore more dangerous. Instead of obvious shame and prohibition, women would face more complex forms of sexual conditioning. Jung foresaw that women would be encouraged to be sexual, but only in specific ways that still served external agendas. They would be told to be confident and empowered, but only within narrow parameters that didn't actually threaten existing power structures. They would be given permission to have desire, but not to trust their desire more than expert opinions about what they should want. Look around today, and you can see exactly what Jung predicted. Women are bombarded with messages about sexual empowerment, but these messages often still center on being sexually appealing to others rather than being sexually authentic to themselves. There's pressure to be sexually adventurous, but in ways that conform to porn-influenced fantasies rather than personal exploration. There's encouragement to be sexually confident, but not sexually autonomous. Jung's solution to this modern dilemma was what he called individual sexual sovereignty. This means taking complete responsibility for your own sexual development, regardless of what society, partners, or experts tell you that you should want or should do. It means being willing to disappoint people if their expectations conflict with your authentic nature, But Jung was also realistic about how challenging this process would be. He understood that sexual conditioning runs so deep that most people can't even recognize it, let alone overcome it. He knew that the process of sexual individuation, like all forms of psychological development, required enormous courage and often involved periods of confusion, loneliness, and social conflict. One of Jung's most powerful insights was that sexual repression doesn't just affect the individual woman, it gets passed down through generations. Mothers who are disconnected from their own sexuality can't model healthy sexual integration for their daughters. They unconsciously pass on the same fears, shame, and confusion that they inherited from their own mothers. Breaking this generational cycle requires what Jung called conscious sexual parenting, though he knew that most parents aren't equipped for this level of awareness. It means helping children, especially daughters, maintain their natural connection to their bodies and their instincts, while also teaching them to navigate a world that will try to exploit or suppress these natural qualities. Jung observed that little girls are naturally sensual beings, connected to their bodies, curious about physical pleasure, unashamed of their desires and needs. But somewhere between childhood and adolescence, most girls learn to disconnect from these natural qualities in order to fit into social expectations of feminine propriety. The tragedy, according to Jung, is that this disconnection happens right at the time when girls are developing their sexual identity. Instead of building their sexuality on a foundation of self-knowledge and body trust, they're forced to construct it based on external expectations and fears. This creates what Jung called false sexual self, a performance of sexuality rather than an expression of it. Now let's talk about what authentic sexual integration looks like according to Jung's model. It's not about becoming hypersexual or sexually rebellious. It's not about rejecting all social norms or boundaries. It's about developing what Jung called conscious sexual choice, the ability to make decisions about your sexuality based on your authentic desires rather than unconscious programming. A woman who has integrated her sexual shadow knows the difference between genuine arousal and performed arousal. She can distinguish between desires that come from her authentic self and desires that have been planted by external influences. She's comfortable setting sexual boundaries not because she's afraid of sex, but because she honors her sexuality enough to protect it from exploitation. This kind of sexual consciousness also involves what Jung called shadow integration of the feminine dark. He recognized that women, like men, have aggressive, selfish, and even destructive sexual impulses that society teaches them to deny. A fully integrated woman acknowledges these darker aspects of her sexuality without being controlled by them. Jung worked with women who discovered that they had fantasies about dominating partners, about being sexually selfish, about experiencing pure physical pleasure without emotional connection. These discoveries often shocked women who had been taught that female sexuality was naturally nurturing, giving, and relationship-focused. But Jung understood that denying these shadow aspects doesn't make them go away. It just makes them unconscious and therefore more likely to be expressed in destructive ways. A woman who can't consciously acknowledge her sexual selfishness might unconsciously manipulate partners through sexual withholding. A woman who can't own her desire for sexual variety might unconsciously sabotage committed relationships. The goal isn't to act on every sexual impulse, but to be conscious of the full spectrum of your sexual nature so that you can make authentic choices about how to express it. This level of sexual self-awareness requires what Jung called ego strength, the ability to hold paradox and complexity without needing to resolve everything into simple categories. Jung also emphasized that sexual shadow integration isn't a solo journey. He believed that authentic sexuality could only be fully expressed in relationship with others, whether romantic, sexual, or even platonic relationships that involve emotional and energetic intimacy. But these relationships had to be based on mutual consciousness and respect for each person's individual sexual development. This is where Jung's ideas become challenging for many people. He didn't believe in the romantic ideal of finding someone who completes your sexual self. Instead, he advocated for relationships between sexually sovereign individuals who choose to share their authentic sexual expression with each other without losing their individual integrity. Jung observed that most sexual relationships involve some level of unconscious projection, where partners try to use each other to heal their own sexual wounds or to experience aspects of sexuality that they can't access within themselves. While this might create temporary excitement or connection, it ultimately prevents both partners from developing authentic sexual maturity. A conscious sexual relationship, according to Jung, involves two people who have done their own individual shadow work and can therefore relate to each other from authenticity rather than neediness or projection. This doesn't mean the relationship lacks passion or intensity, but that the passion comes from genuine connection rather than unconscious psychological dynamics. Jung believed that this kind of conscious sexuality was not only possible, but necessary for individual psychological health and social evolution. He saw the mass sexual unconsciousness of his time as a symptom of broader cultural immaturity, and he believed that individual sexual awakening was part of the solution to humanity's larger psychological and spiritual challenges. But Jung also understood that most people aren't ready for this level of sexual consciousness. He knew that it requires facing fears, challenging conditioning, and often accepting social isolation or conflict. He knew that it means taking responsibility for your own sexual satisfaction, rather than expecting others to provide it for you. For women specifically, Jung recognized that sexual shadow integration often involves grieving the loss of certain illusions about femininity, relationships, and sexuality that they had been taught to believe. It means accepting that authentic sexuality might not match cultural ideals of feminine beauty, romantic love, or sexual performance. Many women discover through this process that their authentic sexuality is messier, more complex, and more demanding than they had been taught was acceptable. They might find that they need more space, more variety, more intensity, or different kinds of stimulation than they had been performing. They might discover that their sexual desires change cyclically, or that they need different things at different life stages. Jung emphasized that this kind of sexual authenticity isn't selfish or destructive when it's based on genuine self-knowledge rather than reactive rebellion. A woman who knows and honors her authentic sexuality is actually more capable of genuine intimacy and more reliable as a partner because she's not performing a false self that will eventually become unsustainable. The process Jung outlined for sexual shadow integration involves several stages. First, recognizing the extent to which your current sexual expression has been shaped by external forces rather than authentic desire. This often involves examining childhood messages, cultural conditioning, and relationship patterns that have influenced your sexual development. Second, allowing yourself to feel the grief and anger that often arise when you realize how much of your authentic sexuality has been suppressed or distorted. Jung warned that this stage can be intense and may require support from a therapist or counselor who understands sexual shadow work. Third, carefully and consciously beginning to experiment with expressing more authentic sexual desires while maintaining appropriate boundaries and safety. Jung emphasized that this isn't about immediately acting on every sexual impulse, but about slowly expanding your comfort zone with your own sexual truth. Fourth, learning to communicate about sexuality in ways that honor both your authenticity and your relationships with others. This often involves developing new language for talking about sex, desire, boundaries, and needs. Finally, integrating your reclaimed sexuality into your broader life and identity rather than keeping it compartmentalized or hidden. Jung believed that authentic sexuality should inform and energize all aspects of your life, not just your romantic or sexual relationships. Jung was clear that this process doesn't have a clear endpoint. Sexual individuation, like all forms of psychological development, is an ongoing journey rather than a destination. As you grow and change, your sexuality will also evolve, and staying connected to your authentic sexual self requires ongoing attention and consciousness. But Jung also believed that the rewards of this journey extend far beyond personal satisfaction. He saw sexually conscious individuals as agents of cultural evolution, people who could model healthier relationships and contribute to the collective healing of humanity's sexual wounds. The question Jung would ask you is this: are you willing to face the truth about how much of your sexual self has been shaped by forces outside your control? Are you ready to discover what your sexuality might become if it were freed from the expectations, fears, and limitations that you've inherited from a sexually unconscious culture? Jung understood that not everyone would be ready for this level of sexual awakening. He knew that it requires courage, support, and often a willingness to challenge relationships and social structures that benefit from your sexual unconsciousness. But he also believed that for those who are ready, sexual shadow integration offers a path to psychological wholeness and authentic personal power that no external source can provide. This is Jung's ultimate message about female sexuality. The power that has been hidden from you, the desires that have been shamed, the instincts that have been suppressed, they're still there, waiting to be reclaimed. But reclaiming them isn't just about personal pleasure or satisfaction. It's about accessing the full spectrum of your life force and using it to create the relationships, the work, and the life that truly reflect who you are beneath all the conditioning. In this video, our objective isn't to claim that this perspective is the only correct one. We want to present Jung's thesis as an intellectual provocation, a form of critical thinking presented in an impactful way, but without inducing anyone to blind acceptance. The intention is to create space for critical thinking, encourage reflection, and allow each person to decide for themselves what to believe. We're not presenting absolute truth, but rather a psychological and theoretical proposal that's worth knowing and questioning. Jung's vision of sexually conscious women wasn't about rejecting all social structures or moral frameworks. It was about developing the psychological maturity to choose consciously how to express your sexuality, rather than being unconsciously controlled by forces you don't understand. It was about reclaiming your right to desire what you desire, and to make authentic choices about how to honor those desires in ways that serve your highest development. This is Jung's challenge to every woman. Discover what you've been afraid to want, acknowledge what you've been taught to shame, and begin the slow, careful work of integrating your sexual shadow into conscious expression. The world needs women who are sexually awake, not because sexuality is the most important thing, but because sexual consciousness is inseparable from the kind of authentic personal power that can change everything.